in the national law, each individually, what is a serious crime where the data stored under this directive can be used. The rules to access the data can be defined or should be defined in national law. That effectively means while there is or isn't a harmonized way to store it, it's very different procedures on who can access it, how it is accessed, if it needs a court order at all, or if it's just freely accessible to law enforcement. That fortunately is not so in Germany, I have to say. Here it would at least require a judge to sign on the access of the data. The positive thing is that no content data whatsoever can now be stored under this directive. Quote is, no data revealing the content of the communication can be retained pursuant to this directive. That is quite different to what we had before. This, for example, prevents storage of things like URLs or significant portions of SMS messages, for example. Let's look a little bit at the categories of data. It is, in a way, quite entertaining. There's 4 types, in general, which need to be retained. One falls under the heading of data necessary to trace and identify the source of a communication. So basically the originator of every communication. I've skipped the other parts. There's quite a bit on telephony and GSM mobile networks in this. I focus here on the internet side because it's my assumption that for this Congress this is the more relevant part. Specifically, the types now for internet access now only relate to internet access, internet email, and internet telephony. All the other protocols, other things, we, at least for now, were able to strip out of the whole proposal. What needs to be retained in this, assuming you are the service provider for this, that is the big question, is the user ID allocated for every transmission of this type? User ID and telephone number allocated to any communication entering the public telephone network. That, of course, is more relevant for voice over IP. So a lot of this is concerning telephone calls. If you really talk to law enforcement, they want telephone calls and emails. That's more or less the only thing they can handle right now. Yes, there's things like chat or other forms of instant messaging, peer-to-peer networks, but they can't handle it. So they have no equipment, they have no knowledge how to handle it. But obviously, if they have a call in the public telephone network and this then traces back to a voice over IP call, they want to be able to identify the user who placed that call. And obviously, the user data, which means that the address database, the subscriber data you have, needs to be able to be mapped against the communication. I do think that this is a very valid concern. If you have, through whatever means you can actually trace something to a user ID, one should be able to map this user ID to a real person, at least for serious crimes. Obviously, there's also data to be stored which purports to the destination of a communication. That's the second part. In here, we're missing the access part. It's only internet email and internet telephony, which is of interest. Again, user ID or telephone number. And this is actually quotes on the proposal. So this is as it is in the text. There's not much more detail. There's no explanations of what this means. And if you talk to them, for example, things like a user ID, it's not even clear what this means. And it can mean several things. I mean, we think, okay, user ID can be anything, your email address, your login name, something like that. But they're not clear about what they mean with it. And especially gets interesting if you have several users on one connection, which in a broadband world is quite normal, I'd say. And again, obviously, the mapping of the administrative data names and addresses to these user IDs. Data necessary to identify date and time. This was our biggest concern in the beginning, because for a lot of protocols that is rather difficult. When does a communication start? When does a communication stop? I personally feel it's still very difficult to attribute this to an internet telephony call. Yes, you might get the data out of a SIP server, but no one tells you when the call was actually terminated or if it's still ongoing, and the call just has nothing to do with the signaling. The things like the duration of a call, very difficult. However, what they want basically is login times, log-off times, the IP addresses used, and basically this boils down to storing IP address to username mappings and your dynamic allocation. If you have that, at least for Germany, that would probably cover it. And of course, you need the log files of SIP servers or email servers. And that's what law enforcement wants. The text says it a bit different, but that's effectively what this is what this is aimed at. Identify the type of communication. Okay, that's basically the service used. That's very short for internet. This is a very long paragraph for mobile networks, for example, because they're looking at all the different types of messages separately, MMS, SMS, this type of stuff. What we couldn't get out, unfortunately, is the user equipment part, law enforcement, and that comes again from the mobile world, from the emails and everything. They want identification about the actual equipment used by the user. Okay, holding telephone numbers in dial-up access, that might be understandable because it's necessary to trace a communication at all in a calling world where you can do anonymous internet access, call-by-call style. For DSL lines, that's a bit more of a problem. Also for all sorts of broadband connections, they want to know which device actually initiated the communication. We were able to strip out MAC addresses. Originally, this proposal had MAC addresses in there as well. Very strange thing because it's not really a fixed address for a device. And they have a strange issue in this text at that point, because the 3 dots you see down on the screen, that is actually in the text. It is probably a little bit extensible in the end, but it's a bit strange because it is now not in an annex, it is in the text, meaning that it would have to go through Parliament again. I don't know how Parliament could approve 3 dots, but obviously that's fine for them. If we compare what we have now to other states, this is all introduced under the fight for terrorism. Okay, we've heard that a million times, a zillion times on television lately. Strangely enough, the biggest terrorist fighter, the US, I mean, they start wars about this. They see no advantage in data retention. There is no data retention measure introduced or even proposed in the US. The state agencies in the US think that fast freeze, quick thaw is the better method. They first wanted indications through some other means on who to look at before they actually want data stored. Israel, another big target for terrorists, they think that the personal rights are the higher good, and they don't want data retention at all. That's the official position today. On the other hand, Ireland, I think it's positive that they would actually fight it in court. They will fight this directive in court, not because it implements data retention. No, it undermines their own data retention rules, which are already there and which call for 3 years. So there will be countries going against the current directive because they think that their personal position or their national position is undermined. Even bigger, from my personal point of view, are the changes we have in France lately. End of November, they've introduced a new police law, which would allow law enforcement to access data stored under this directive without any court order. That's what I would call a police state. if police can simply access data of this type, data which really seriously undermines your personal rights without a court order, without a judge reviewing it. For every investigation, they can simply ask for this data, and as a provider, you'll have to deliver. Poland, even worse, they think that storage time frame of 15 years sounds good to them. I'm not really sure where this is going, even for documents and legal documents and everything. They just have a 10-year time frame, so I'm not really sure what you want with 15 years of telecommunication data. But that is their current position. And so far, with the new government they have there, no one is going against this. Obviously, this impacts human rights. Personally, I feel threatened. I don't want this. Why does anyone have the right to store my communication data? I'll go into can they store my communication data a little bit later, but that's a different discussion. In the past, parliaments throughout Europe have rejected data retention. They have rejected it in Germany, they have rejected it in the UK. Most of the significant countries have rejected it. Still, governments have followed it through. I think there's an interesting break that governments can actually want something in the EU or through EU measures which they cannot go through or cannot enforce in the national legislation. The data protection officials, they have raised their voices and they see they have serious concerns. They think that this new legislation is incompatible with basic rights. This basically because without any clue, without a starting point, police will have data available. Normally, and that's the overturn in the basic principle, any investigation only starts at some point in time. You cannot go back in time with the investigation. At least you don't have data to go back in time. And this is now overturned for everyone, for every individual. And we have in the Human Rights Convention the right of privacy in communication. That is a very basic right, and only for serious offenses it can be undermined. Now we have a general provision which undermines it beforehand. This is simply unacceptable. There are organizations like Privacy International which will start a court case against this, which everyone can join. If you visit their webpage, you can sign it. Factual analysis, what happened here? In the whole consultation process, and I've followed this process for 2 years in Brussels now, or 1 3/4. Law enforcement was never able to demonstrate the effectiveness of data retention. There are other means, like fast freeze quick-thaw, which really impacts only one user at that point in time, not everyone, which in countries like the US have proven much more effective than data retention ever would. Law enforcement doesn't have the processing capabilities to actually use the data stored in data retention. So a means which would actually give them what they're really looking for is a lot easier and will in the end be quicker in the whole process than having huge amounts of data they cannot process in an adequate time frame. In the media, law enforcement, or especially interior ministers, claimed that they have demonstrated where data retention or data stored in the past, which was accidentally available at providers, helped solve cases. I can tell you it was only 3 cases which were named. Always the same cases. It was one from the Netherlands, one from Spain, and one from London, or from UK. And that was overlaying data. All of them were related to mobile devices. None of it concerned internet data. None of it even concerned traditional voice telephony. Why would one want data which they cannot process? That is the big question which popped up over internet data. law enforcement today is not aware of the problems they face with internet data.